The crystal glasses sparkled under the bright lights of the Whitmore Financial Building. Tonight was special. Margaret Whitmore had planned the biggest charity event of the year. She was the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the city. Everyone knew her name. Everyone feared her sharp tongue. Margaret walked through the main hall wearing a long black dress that cost more than most people made in 3 months. Her high heels clicked on the marble floor as she checked every detail. The flowers had to be perfect. The food had to be the best. The music had to sound just right. Nothing could go wrong tonight. Rich people filled the room. Business owners, lawyers, doctors, and politicians all came to give money to charity. But Margaret knew the real reason they came. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to show off their expensive clothes and jewelry. They wanted to talk about their big houses and fancy cars. Margaret loved events like this. She felt powerful when she saw how people looked at her. They wanted her approval. They wanted her friendship. They wanted her business deals. She enjoyed watching them try so hard to impress her. The hired pianist sat at the beautiful black piano in the corner of the room. His name was James, and he had played at many fancy parties before. He was good, but not great. Margaret had hired him because he was cheap, not because he was the best. James started playing some light classical music. The guests talked and laughed while he played. Most of them did not really listen to the music. It was just background noise to them. Margaret walked around the room, talking to important people and making sure everyone saw her. "Mrs. Whitmore," said Robert Chun, a banker, who wanted to do business with her company. "This is a wonderful event. You always know how to bring the right people together." Margaret smiled coldly. "Money brings people together. Mr. Chun, these people are here because they want something from me or want to give me something I need." Robert laughed nervously. He was not sure if she was joking or being serious. With Margaret, it was always hard to tell. The evening went on and more people arrived. The hall became crowded and noisy. Margaret felt satisfied as she watched her guests eat expensive food and drink costly wine. This event would raise a lot of money for charity, but more importantly, it would show everyone how powerful she was. Then something started to go wrong with the music. James had been playing for over an hour, and his fingers were getting tired. Margaret had asked him to play a difficult piece by Chopin. It was called Nocturne in I-flat major. The music was beautiful but very hard to play well. James had practiced it many times, but he was nervous. There were so many important people watching. His fingers stumbled on the keys. The wrong notes sounded terrible in the quiet room. Some guests turned to look at the piano. James felt sweat on his forehead. He tried to start the piece again, but he made more mistakes. Margaret noticed the bad music right away. She felt angry. How dare this pianist embarrass her in front of all these important people? She had paid him good money to play well, and he was ruining her perfect evening. She walked toward the piano with fast, angry steps. Her face showed her displeasure. People moved out of her way as she crossed the room. They could see she was upset about something. "Stop," Margaret said loudly when she reached the piano. Her voice cut through the noise of conversation. "Just stop playing." James looked up at her with fear in his eyes. He could see how angry she was. His hands shook as he lifted them off the piano keys. The room became quiet as people realized something was happening. Margaret looked around at all the faces watching her. She felt embarrassed that her hired musician had played so badly. She needed to say something that would make her look strong and in control again. "This is supposed to be Chopin," she said in a loud, clear voice. "One of the greatest composers who ever lived. And this is how his beautiful music gets treated?" She looked at James with disgust. "If you cannot play Chopin properly, then do not play it at all. This music requires skill, talent, and respect. It is not for amateurs who think they can stumble." Through it, the guests watched in uncomfortable silence. Some felt sorry for James, but none of them dared to speak against Margaret. She was too powerful, too important to their own business and social lives. Margaret felt the power of having everyone's attention. She decided to make her point even stronger. She wanted to show these people what real standards look like. She wanted them to remember this moment and talk about it for months. You know what? Margaret said, her voice getting louder and more confident. I am tired of people who pretend to have talents they do not possess. I am tired of mediocrity being accepted as good enough. She turned to face the entire room of guests. Her eyes were bright with anger and pride. If anyone here can actually play Chopin properly, and I mean really play it with skill and feeling, then I will marry them on the spot. The room erupted in surprised laughter. People looked at each other with wide eyes and nervous smiles. Some thought Margaret was making a joke. Others wondered if she was serious. But everyone could hear the anger and arrogance in her voice. I mean it, Margaret continued, enjoying the shocked faces around her. Find me someone who can play Chopin the way it should be played, and I will marry them tonight. But I guarantee you will not find anyone in this room with that kind of talent. She looked around at all the wealthy guests with a mean smile, because real talent is rare. Real skill takes years to develop, and most people are just not good. Enough. The laughter grew louder, but it was uncomfortable laughter. People did not know how to respond to Margaret's strange challenge. They clapped politely and went back to their conversations, whispering about what had just happened. James packed up his music and left the party quickly. He felt humiliated and angry, but he needed the money Margaret had paid him. He could not afford to argue with someone so powerful. Margaret felt satisfied with herself. She had shown everyone that she would not accept anything less than perfection. She had proven that she had higher standards than everyone else in the room. She walked back through the crowd, accepting compliments and comments about her passionate speech about quality. But Margaret had no idea that someone else had been listening to every word she said. Someone had heard her cruel challenge and her mean comments about talent and skill. Someone who knew more about Chopin than anyone else. In that room, someone who was about to change everything. Henry Rodriguez pushed his cleaning cart slowly along the edge of the big room. He had been working as a janitor in the Whitmore Financial Building for 15 years. During that time, he had seen many fancy parties and important meetings. But the people at these events never really saw him. To them, Henry was invisible. He was just part of the building, like the walls or the furniture. They talked freely in front of him because they forgot he was there. They made private business deals and shared secrets, never thinking that the quiet man emptying their trash cans might be listening. Henry was 58 years old. His hair was gray, and his hands were rough from years of hard work. He wore a simple blue uniform with his name tag pinned to his shirt. His cart was filled with cleaning supplies, fresh towels, and empty trash bags. He moved quietly through the party, doing his job without bothering anyone. Tonight was like many other nights for Henry. Rich people in expensive clothes ate fancy food and talked about money. They laughed too loudly and drank too much wine. They acted like they were the most important people in the world. Henry had seen it all before, but something was different about tonight. When the pianist started having trouble with the Chopin piece, Henry stopped working and listened carefully. Music had always meant something special to him. Even though he tried not to think about it anymore, Henry knew that piece of music very well. It was Nocturne in E-flat major by Frédéric Chopin. He had played it hundreds of times many years ago. He knew every note, every gentle melody, every soft and loud part. He could play it in his sleep. When Margaret started yelling at the poor pianist, Henry felt something stir inside his chest. It was a feeling he had not experienced in a very long time. It was anger mixed with sadness, mixed with memory. Henry had not always been a janitor. Long ago, he had been a different person with a different life. But that was before everything changed. That was before he had to give up his dreams and accept a life he had never wanted. As Margaret made her cruel speech about talent and skill, Henry remembered things he tried hard to forget. He remembered sitting at a beautiful piano in a small apartment. He remembered his daughter Sophia clapping her hands as he played. He remembered the acceptance letter from the Juilliard School of Music that had made his family so proud. Juilliard was one of the best music schools in the world. Only the most talented students got accepted there. Henry had worked for years to get good enough to audition. He had practiced piano for hours every day since he was 7 years old. His parents had saved money for his lessons even when they could barely afford food. When Henry was 18, he had played his audition piece perfectly. The judges at Juilliard were impressed with his skill and his passion for music. They offered him a full scholarship to study classical piano. It was the happiest day of his life. Henry had dreams of becoming a concert pianist. He wanted to play in famous halls around the world. He wanted to record albums and teach other young musicians. He wanted to share the beauty of classical music with everyone who would listen. For 2 years, Henry studied at Juilliard. He was one of the best students in his class. His teachers said he had a special gift for understanding music. They said he could make the piano sing in ways that touched people's hearts, but then everything fell apart. Henry's father got very sick with cancer. The medical bills were huge, and the family had no money to pay them. Henry's mother worked 2 jobs, but it was not enough. They needed Henry to come home and help take care of his father and earn money for the family. Henry had to make the hardest choice of his life. He could stay at Juilliard and follow his dreams, knowing his family would suffer. Or he could give up his music education and go home to help the people he loved. There was really no choice at all. Henry left school and never went back. He got a job at a factory to help pay the medical bills. At night, he took care of his sick father. He had no time for music anymore. The piano in their apartment gathered dust because Henry was too tired and too sad to play it. His father died 6 months later. Henry felt guilty that all his sacrifice had not been enough to save him. The medical bills had used up all their savings, and the family lost their house. They had to move to a small, cheap apartment with no room for a piano. Henry married his girlfriend Maria when he was 23. She was a kind woman who understood his sadness about losing his music. She encouraged him to start playing again, but Henry found it too painful. Every time he touched piano keys, he remembered everything he had lost. Henry and Maria had a daughter named Sophia. She was the light of Henry's life. She had her father's love of music and her mother's gentle spirit. Even as a small child, Sophia would sit next to Henry and beg him to play piano for her. Henry found work as a janitor because the hours were good and the pay was steady. It was not the life he had planned, but it was honest work that helped him take care of his family. Maria worked as a waitress, and together they made enough money to live simply but comfortably. When Sophia was 5 years old, Henry finally started playing piano again. He could not resist his daughter's sweet requests for music. He would play gentle classical pieces while she danced around their small living room. Her favorite song was the same Chopin nocturne that the pianist had tried to play tonight. "Play the beautiful night song, Papa," Sophia would say. That was what she called the nocturne in E-flat major. Henry would play it softly while she fell asleep in his lap. Those were the happiest years of Henry's adult life. He had given up his dreams of being a famous pianist, but he found joy in sharing music with his daughter. Maybe this was enough, he thought. Maybe family love was better than fame and success, but happiness did not last long for Henry's family. When Sophia was 8 years old, she got sick with leukemia. The doctors tried everything they could, but the cancer was too strong. Henry and Maria spent all their time and money trying to save their little girl. Henry took extra jobs to pay for her treatments. He cleaned offices at night and washed dishes at restaurants during the day. Sophia died on a cold winter morning when she was 9 years old. Her last request was for Henry to play the beautiful night song one more time. He played Chopin's Nocturne while she closed her eyes forever. After Sophia died, Henry could not touch a piano again. The music reminded him too much of his lost daughter. Maria tried to help him heal, but her own heart was broken too. She died in a car accident 2 years later, leaving Henry completely alone in the world. Henry had now been alone for 18 years. He worked as a night janitor at the Whitmore building because he needed the job to survive. He lived in a small apartment with no piano and no music. He tried not to think about the past or the dreams he had given up. But tonight, as Margaret Whitmore stood in front of all those rich people and mocked the idea that anyone could play Chopin properly, something woke up inside Henry's heart. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time. Henry looked at Margaret's angry, proud face and thought about his daughter Sophia. He thought about all the nights he had played that beautiful nocturne to help her fall asleep. He thought about the joy that music had brought to their small family. Margaret said that real talent was rare. She said that most people were not good enough to play classical music the right way. She challenged anyone in the room to prove her wrong. Henry gripped the handle of his mop and felt his heart beating faster. For the first time in 18 years, he wanted to sit at a piano again. He wanted to play Sophia's favorite song. He wanted to show this cruel woman what real talent looked like, but Henry was just a janitor. These people would never listen to him. They would laugh at him or tell him to go back to his work. He was nobody important in their world, or was he? Henry looked at the beautiful black piano sitting empty on the stage. He looked at Margaret still talking loudly about standards and quality. He looked at all the rich people who thought they were better than everyone else. Maybe it was time for them to learn something new. The pianist James had left the building, and the beautiful black piano sat empty on the small stage. The guests went back to their conversations, but they kept talking about Margaret's strange challenge. Some laughed about it. Others whispered that she had been too mean to the poor musician. Margaret felt proud of herself. She had shown everyone that she would not accept anything less than perfection. She walked through the crowd, smiling as people complimented her passionate speech about quality and standards. "You really told him, Margaret," said Patricia Wells, the wife of a famous lawyer. "These people who call themselves musicians these days just do not have real training." "Exactly," Margaret replied, sipping her expensive wine. "In my day, musicians had to prove themselves before they performed in public. Now anyone with a few piano lessons thinks they can play classical music." Henry continued his work, but his mind was not on cleaning. Every few minutes he looked at the empty piano. The instrument seemed to be calling to him, reminding him of everything he had lost and everything he used to be. He emptied trash cans and wiped down tables, but his hands were shaking slightly. Images of Sophia kept flooding his memory. He could almost hear her sweet voice asking him to play the beautiful night song. He could almost see her small face lighting up with joy when the music started. Margaret was still talking loudly about the importance of real talent. "I have been to the best concerts in the world," she told a group of businessmen. "I have heard true masters play Chopin, Beethoven, and Mozart. What we heard tonight was an insult to those great composers." Henry stopped working and really listened. To her words, an insult to the great composers? Sophia had never thought his music was an insult to anyone. She had thought it was the most beautiful sound in the world. When Henry played for her, she would close her eyes and smile like she was hearing angels sing. "The problem with people today," Margaret continued, "is that they do not understand the difference between playing notes and making music. Anyone can press piano keys, but very few people can bring life to a piece of classical music." Those words hit Henry like a punch to his stomach. He knew exactly what she meant about bringing life to music. He had spent years learning how to do that. His teachers at Juilliard had told him he had a special gift for making people feel emotions through his playing, but Margaret was talking about this gift like it was something only rich, educated people could have. She was acting like poor people or working people could never understand real music. She was wrong, and Henry knew it. Henry thought about his father, who had worked in a factory all his life but loved to listen to classical music on the radio. He thought about his mother, who had cleaned houses for wealthy families but saved every penny she could to pay for Henry's piano lessons. He thought about Sophia, who had understood the beauty of Chopin better than anyone he had ever met. These people had never been to fancy music schools or expensive concerts, but they knew good music when they heard it. They felt it in their hearts and souls. Margaret's idea that only certain types of people could appreciate classical music was not just wrong. It was cruel. Henry remembered something his first piano teacher had told him when he was just 8 years old. "Music belongs to everyone, Henry," the old man had said. "Rich or poor, educated or not, music speaks to the human heart. Never let anyone tell you that you do not deserve to make beautiful sounds." But Henry had let people tell him that, hadn't he? When life got hard and he had to give up Juilliard, He had accepted that music was not for people like him. When Sophia died and playing piano became too painful, he had decided that music was something from his past that he could never have again. Maybe he had been wrong about that. Margaret was still holding court with her audience of wealthy admirers. I would bet money that there is not one person in this entire building who could play that Chopin piece the way it deserves to be played, she said with a laugh. Not one person in the entire building? Henry almost smiled at that. If only she knew who was standing 20 feet away from her, quietly emptying her guest's wine glasses into his cleaning bucket. Henry looked down at his rough, worn hands. These hands had once moved across piano keys like they were made for nothing else. These hands had created music that made his daughter dance with joy. These hands had earned him a place at one of the most famous music schools in the world. But these hands also showed the story of his life after music. There were small scars from factory work and cleaning chemicals. His fingers were not as smooth and flexible as they used to be. He had not played piano in 18 years. Could these hands still make beautiful music? Henry thought about Sophia's last day. She had been so weak and tired from her illness, but she had still asked him to play her favorite song. "Please, Papa," she had whispered, "play the beautiful night song one more time." Henry had played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major that day, with tears streaming down his face. Even though his heart was breaking, the music had been perfect. Sophia had smiled and closed her eyes, and Henry knew that his playing had brought her peace in her final moments. That was what real music could do. It could comfort the sick, heal the broken-hearted, and bring beauty into the darkest times. Margaret Whitmore would never understand that. Because she only saw music as a way to show off her wealth and education, Henry made a decision that surprised him. He was going to play that piano. He was going to show Margaret and all her rich friends what real talent looked like. He was going to honor Sophia's memory by playing her favorite song the way it deserved to be played. He was going to prove that music belonged to everyone, not just people who could afford expensive concert tickets. But first, he had to find the courage to walk across that room. Henry had spent 15 years being invisible in this building. He had trained himself to move quietly, work efficiently, and never draw attention to himself. Now he was thinking about walking onto a stage in front of hundreds of wealthy, powerful people. What if they laughed at him? What if they called security to remove him? What if Margaret fired him from his job? Henry needed this work to pay his rent and buy food. He could not afford to lose his income because of one moment of pride, but then Henry heard Margaret's voice again, even louder than before. The truth is, most people these days have no appreciation for real culture. They listen to popular music and think they understand art. They have never learned what it takes to master something truly difficult. That was enough. Henry could not listen to another word. Margaret was talking about people like his parents, who had worked hard all their lives and still found time to love beautiful things. She was talking about people like Sophia, who had heard the soul of music even as a small child. She was talking about people like Henry himself, who had sacrificed his dreams so his family could survive. Henry set down his mop and straightened his shoulders. He looked at the piano again, and this time he did not see an impossible challenge. He saw an old friend waiting for him to come home. Sophia would have wanted him to play. She would have been proud to see her father stand up for what was right and beautiful in the world. She would have clapped her hands and danced if she could see him walking toward that piano. Henry took a deep breath and started moving toward the stage. His legs felt shaky, but he kept walking. Some people noticed him moving through the crowd, but they assumed he was just doing his cleaning work. Margaret was still talking about talent and standards, completely unaware that someone was about to prove her very, very wrong. Henry reached the edge of the stage and looked up at the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, much nicer than the old piano he had learned on as a child. The keys looked perfect and clean. Henry could tell just by looking that it would sound wonderful. He put his foot on the first step leading up to the stage. This was it. Once he climbed those steps, there would be no going back. Everyone would see him. Everyone would know who he really was. Henry thought about Sophia one more time. Then he started climbing. Henry climbed the 3 steps to the stage slowly and carefully. His heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. The stage felt different from the main floor. Up here, he was visible to everyone in the room. Up here, there was no way to hide. At first, only a few people noticed him. They saw a man in a janitor's uniform walking toward the piano and assumed he was there to clean something or move the instrument. They went back to their conversations without giving him another thought, but as Henry got closer to the piano bench, more people began to pay attention. This was strange. Why was the cleaning man walking toward the piano? Was there something wrong with the instrument? Margaret was still talking to her group of admirers near the bar area. She had her back to the stage and did not see what was happening. She was too busy enjoying the compliments about her speech and her high standards for music. "You know, Margaret," said Dr. Richard Sterling, a wealthy doctor who wanted to impress her, "I completely agree with you about the decline of musical education. In Europe, they still understand the importance of proper training." Margaret nodded and sipped her wine. "Exactly, real musicians spend decades perfecting their craft. They do not just learn a few songs and think they are ready to perform in public." While Margaret continued her conversation, Henry reached the piano. He stood next to the beautiful black instrument and looked down at the keys. They were perfect white and black rectangles, just like the keys he had practiced on thousands of times many years ago. Henry put his hand gently on the piano bench. The leather was soft and expensive. He had sat on many piano benches in his life, but never one this nice. At Juilliard, the practice room pianos had old, worn benches that had been used by hundreds of students. More people in the crowd started noticing Henry. They whispered to each other and pointed toward the stage. What was the janitor doing? Why was he touching the piano? "Look at that," said Mrs. Beverly Thompson, pointing with her champagne glass. "I think the cleaning man is going to sit at the piano." Her husband Charles looked toward the stage and frowned. "That's odd. Maybe someone told him to check if it was working properly." But Henry was not checking anything. He was preparing to sit down. He looked out at the crowd of wealthy people in their expensive clothes. Most of them were still talking and laughing, not paying attention to him. But some were watching with curious expressions. Henry thought about all the times he had performed for audiences before. When he was a student at Juilliard, he had played in recitals for other students and teachers. When Sophia was little, he had played at her school for special events. But this was different. This was the biggest audience he had ever faced, and they had no idea who he really was. Henry slowly sat down on the piano bench. The movement was automatic, like riding a bicycle after years of not practicing. His body remembered how to sit at a piano, even though his mind was full of doubts. He adjusted the bench height, moving it up just a little bit. This was something all serious piano players did to make sure they could reach the keys comfortably. The simple action showed that Henry knew what he was doing, even though most people in the room did not understand its significance. Now, more people were definitely staring. A man in a janitor's uniform was sitting at the piano like he planned to play it. This was becoming interesting. "Margaret," said Patricia Wells, tapping her friend on the shoulder, "I think you should look at the stage." Margaret turned around, still holding her wine glass. When she saw Henry sitting at the piano, her face changed immediately. The pleasant smile disappeared, and her eyes became cold and angry. "What is he doing?" Margaret said in a sharp voice. "Why is that man touching my piano?" Margaret started walking toward the stage with quick, angry steps. Her high heels clicked loudly on the marble floor. People moved out of her way as she crossed the room. Everyone could see that she was upset about something. Henry saw Margaret coming toward him, but he did not move away from the piano. Instead, he placed his hands gently on his knees and took a deep breath. He was scared, but he was also determined. He had come this far, and he was not going to back down now. Margaret reached the bottom of the stage steps and looked up at Henry with fury in her eyes. "Excuse me," she called out in a loud, sharp voice. "This is a private event. That piano is not for you to touch." The room began to get quiet as people realized something dramatic was happening. Conversation stopped in the middle of sentences. Everyone turned to look at the stage where the angry CEO was confronting the quiet janitor. "Please get away from that instrument immediately," Margaret continued, her voice getting louder. "You have no business being on that stage. Return to your duties right now." Henry looked down at Margaret from the piano bench. She was small and thin, but her anger made her seem bigger and more dangerous. He could see the disgust in her eyes. To her, he was just a worker who had forgotten his place in the world, but Henry did not move. Instead, he spoke for the first time that evening. His voice was quiet but clear, and it carried across the silent room. "I heard your challenge, ma'am," Henry said simply. "You said if anyone could play Chopin properly, you would marry them. I would like to try?" The room erupted in surprised gasps and nervous laughter. Some people could not believe what they were hearing. A janitor was claiming he could play classical music. It seemed impossible. Margaret's face turned red with embarrassment and rage. How dare this cleaning man make a fool of her in front of all these important people? How dare he think he could play music that required years of education and training? "This is ridiculous," Margaret said, her voice shaking with anger. "You are a janitor. You clean floors and empty trash cans. You have no business pretending. You can play classical piano." Henry looked at Margaret with calm, sad eyes. "You said anyone, ma'am. You did not say anyone except janitors." More people gathered around the stage to see what was happening. Some felt embarrassed for Henry, thinking he was about to humiliate himself. Others were curious to see what would happen next. A few secretly hoped the janitor would prove Margaret wrong because they were tired of her arrogant attitude. Margaret realized that everyone was watching and listening. She had to handle this situation carefully. If she was too mean to the janitor, people might think she was cruel. But if she let him play and he failed, it would prove her point about talent and training. "Fine," Margaret said, crossing her arms over her chest. "If you want to embarrass yourself in front of all these people, go ahead. But when you fail, I want you to apologize to everyone here for wasting their time." Henry nodded quietly. "And if I succeed?" he asked. Margaret laughed harshly. "You will not succeed. But if by some miracle you can actually play Chopin properly, then I will keep my word." Henry turned away from Margaret and faced the piano. He flexed his fingers slowly, the way he had learned to do before playing when he was young. His hands were older now, rougher from years of hard work. But the muscles remembered what to do. He placed his hands on the piano keys for the first time in 18 years. The keys felt smooth and cool under his fingers. The piano was perfectly tuned, and even the lightest touch produced a clear, beautiful sound. Henry closed his eyes and thought about Sophia. He thought about her sweet face and her love for the beautiful night song. He thought about all the evenings they had spent together making music in their small apartment. "This is for you, my little girl," Henry whispered so quietly that only he could hear it. Then he began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floated softly through the room. Henry's fingers moved across the keys with surprising grace and confidence. The melody was gentle and sweet, like a lullaby sung by angels. The room fell completely silent. Even the people who had been whispering stopped talking immediately. The music was so beautiful and unexpected that everyone had to listen. Margaret stood frozen at the bottom of the stage steps. Her mouth was slightly open in shock. This was not what she had expected at all. The janitor was not stumbling through the piece like the hired pianist had done. He was playing it perfectly. Henry's eyes were closed as he played. His fingers remembered exactly where each note belonged. The melody flowed from his hands like water from a spring. 18 years had passed since he last touched a piano, but the music was still there inside him, waiting to come out. The nocturne started soft and dreamy. Henry played the opening section with such tenderness that some people in the audience felt tears starting in their eyes. They had never heard this piece played with so much emotion and understanding. Dr. Sterling, who had been talking about European musical education just minutes before, stared at Henry in amazement. "My God," he whispered to his wife. "He is actually quite good." But Henry was much more than quite good. He was extraordinary. As the piece continued, Henry's playing became more confident and expressive. His left hand played the gentle bass notes that supported the melody, while his right hand made the main tune sing like a human voice. Every note was exactly where it should be, and every phrase had perfect timing and feeling. Margaret could not believe what she was hearing. This man who cleaned her building, who she had never really noticed before, was playing Chopin better than many professional pianists she had heard in concert halls. The middle section of the nocturne was more complex, with faster notes and harder rhythms. Henry's fingers moved quickly across the keys, but the music never sounded rushed or sloppy. Each note was clear and beautiful, even in the most difficult passages. Patricia Wells grabbed her husband's arm. "Thomas, listen to this," she whispered. "This is incredible. How is this possible?" Her husband could only shake his head in wonder. He had studied music in college and knew how hard this piece was to play well. What they were hearing should not be possible from a janitor who had probably never had proper training, but they were wrong about Henry's training. They just did not know his story yet. Henry reached the most beautiful part of the nocturne, where the melody climbed high and then fell gently back down. This section always made him think of Sophia because she used to hum along with this part. When he played it for her, as Henry played these special measures, he remembered his daughter's face. He could almost see her sitting next to him on the piano bench, swaying gently with the music. The memory was so clear that for a moment, Henry forgot where he was. He was back in their small apartment, playing for the most important audience he had ever had. The emotion in Henry's playing was so strong that people in the room began to feel it too. Some wiped away tears without really understanding why they were crying. Others felt a strange peace, like they were hearing something sacred and holy. Margaret watched Henry's face as he played. She could see that he was not just pressing the right keys in the right order. He was putting his whole heart and soul into the music. This was not a performance. It was a prayer, a love song, a conversation with someone who was no longer there. The technical skill was impressive enough. Henry's fingerwork was flawless, his timing was perfect, and his understanding of the piece was complete. But it was the emotion that made his playing truly special. He was not just playing Chopin's notes, he was telling Chopin's story, sharing Chopin's feelings about love and loss and beauty. Robert Chun, the banker who had complimented Margaret earlier, stood with his mouth open in shock. He had attended expensive concerts at Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall. He had heard famous pianists play this same piece, but he had never heard anyone bring it to life the way Henry was doing right now. "How is this possible?" Robert whispered to the person next to him. "Where did he learn to play like this?" The question was spreading through the crowd. Who was this janitor? Where had he come from? How could someone who worked cleaning buildings play classical piano like a master? Henry continued playing, unaware of the amazement and confusion around him. He was lost in the music and in his memories. The difficult middle section flowed into the return of the main melody, but now it was even more beautiful because of everything that had come before. This was how the best classical music worked. The composers took simple melodies and developed them, changed them, made them grow and become more complex before bringing them back home. Henry understood this because he had studied it for years. He knew how to make each return of the melody feel like a reunion with an old friend. Margaret found herself listening with her whole being. She had heard this nocturne performed by some of the world's best pianists, but Henry's version was different. It was more personal, more honest, more real. He was not trying to impress anyone or show off his technical skills. He was just sharing the music the way it was meant to be shared. As the piece moved toward its ending, Henry's playing became even more gentle and soft. The final section of the nocturne was like saying goodbye to someone you loved. The notes got quieter and quieter, but they also became more beautiful and meaningful. Henry played the last few measures with such tenderness that the entire room held its breath. No one wanted to make any sound that might disturb the magic they were experiencing. The final note hung in the air for a long moment before it faded away completely. Henry kept his hands on the keys and his eyes closed for several seconds after the music ended. He was still thinking about Sophia, still feeling her presence next to him. Then slowly, Henry opened his eyes and looked out at the audience. The room was completely silent. 200 wealthy, educated, sophisticated people stood staring at him without making a sound. Some had tears on their faces, others looked confused and amazed. All of them had just heard something they would never forget. Margaret stood at the bottom of the stage steps with her hand over her heart. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with shock and something that might have been respect. For the first time in her life, Margaret Whitmore had been proven completely wrong about something important. And the person who had proven her wrong was someone she had never bothered to notice before. The silence stretched on and on. No one knew what to say or do. They had just witnessed something impossible, a janitor playing classical piano better than most professionals. Finally, someone in the back of the room started to clap. Then another person joined in. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in thunderous applause that seemed to go on forever, but Henry barely heard the clapping. He was still thinking about his little girl and the beautiful night song they had shared so many years ago. The applause continued for what felt like forever. People clapped until their hands hurt. Some shouted, "Bravo!" like they were at a famous concert hall. Others wiped tears from their eyes while they clapped. Everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Henry sat quietly at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. He had not played for an audience in 18 years, and he had forgotten how it felt to share music with other people. The applause was wonderful, but it also made him sad because it reminded him of everything he had lost. Margaret still stood at the bottom of the stage steps. Her face showed a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been shame. She had spent the entire evening talking about talent and standards, never knowing that one of the most talented musicians she had ever heard was working in her own building. Finally, the applause began to die down. People wanted to understand what they had just experienced. How was it possible that a janitor could play classical piano better than most professional musicians? Dr. Sterling was the first person brave enough to speak. "Sir," he called out to Henry, "that was absolutely magnificent. Where did you learn to play like that?" Henry looked out at all the faces staring at him. These people wanted answers, and he owed them the truth. He had hidden his past for so long that he had almost forgotten who he used to be. But tonight, sitting at this piano, he remembered everything. Henry stood up slowly from the piano bench. His legs felt shaky, and his heart was still beating fast from the performance and the excitement. He looked down at Margaret, who was staring at him with wide, shocked eyes. "Ma'am," Henry said quietly, "you asked if anyone could play Chopin properly. I believe I have answered your question." Margaret nodded slowly, but she could not find words to respond. Her mind was racing with questions and realizations. How had she been so wrong about this man? Henry turned to face the full audience. 200 people dressed in expensive clothes were waiting to hear his story. He had spent 15 years being invisible to these kinds of people, and now they were hanging on his every word. "My name is Henry Rodriguez," he began, his voice calm and clear. "I have been working as a janitor in this building for 15 years, but that was not always my job." The room was so quiet that people could hear their own heartbeats. Everyone leaned forward to listen more carefully. "When I was young, I was accepted to the Juilliard School of Music in New York City," Henry continued. "I studied classical piano there for 2 years. I wanted to become a concert pianist." Gasps and whispers spread through the crowd. Juilliard was one of the most famous music schools in the world. Only the most talented students were accepted there. This janitor had studied at Juilliard? What happened? Asked Mrs. Thompson, her voice full of genuine curiosity and concern. Henry took a deep breath. He had never told this story to strangers before, but something about tonight made him want to share the truth. "My father got very sick with cancer," Henry said simply. "My family needed money for his medical treatments. They also needed someone to help take care of him. I had to make a choice between my music education and my family." The room was completely silent. People were beginning to understand the sacrifice Henry had made. "I chose my family," Henry continued. I left Juilliard and came home to work and help take care of my father. He died 6 months later, but I never regretted my choice. Dr. Sterling felt a lump forming in his throat. As a doctor, he knew how expensive cancer treatments could be. He also knew how many families were destroyed by medical bills they could not afford. I got married and had a daughter named Sophia, Henry said, and for the first time his voice showed emotion. She was the most beautiful little girl in the world. She loved music just like I did. Henry paused and looked down at the piano keys. The piece I just played was her favorite song. She called it the Beautiful Night Song. I used to play it for her every evening before she went to sleep. Some people in the audience were starting to cry. They could hear the love and loss in Henry's voice. When Sophia was 8 years old, she got sick with leukemia, Henry continued, his voice getting quieter. We tried everything to save her, but the doctors could not help her. She died when she was 9 years old. Now, many people in the room were openly crying. Margaret felt tears running down her own cheeks, which surprised her because she rarely cried about anything. The last thing Sophia asked me to do was play the Beautiful Night Song for her one more time, Henry said. I played it while she closed her eyes and went to sleep forever. Henry had to pause for a moment to control his emotions. Even after 8 years, talking about Sophia was still very difficult. After my daughter died, I could not play piano anymore, Henry said. It reminded me too much of her. I put away my music and tried to forget that part of my life. Robert. June understood now why Henry's playing had been so emotional. He was not just playing notes on a piano, he was honoring the memory of his lost daughter. My wife Maria died in a car accident 2 years later, Henry continued. I have been alone since then. I work as a janitor because I need the job to survive. I have not touched a piano in 18 years until tonight. The room was filled with the sound of people crying softly. Even some of the men were wiping away tears. Henry's story was so sad and so honest that it touched everyone's heart. Margaret realized that while she had been giving speeches about talent and standards, a man with more talent than anyone in the room had been quietly cleaning up after her guests. While she had been talking about the importance of proper training, someone who had actually received that training was emptying her trash cans. Why did you decide to play tonight? Asked Patricia Wells, her voice shaking with emotion. Henry looked directly at Margaret when he answered. Because I heard someone say that real talent was rare and that most people were not good enough to understand classical music. I thought about my father, who worked in a factory but loved to listen to Chopin on the radio. I thought about my mother, who cleaned houses for rich families but saved every penny to pay for my piano lessons. I thought about Sophia, who understood the beauty of music better than anyone I ever met. Henry's voice grew stronger as he continued. These people were not educated or wealthy, but they knew good music when they heard it. Music does not belong only to people who can afford expensive concert tickets. Music belongs to everyone. Margaret felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. Every word Henry spoke made her realize how wrong and cruel her attitudes had been. I also played tonight because I wanted to honor Sophia's memory, Henry said, looking back at the piano. She would have wanted me to share the Beautiful Night Song with other people. She would have been proud to see her father stand up for what is right and good in this world. The audience burst into applause again, but this time it was different. It was not just appreciation for beautiful music, it was respect for a man who had shown incredible courage and dignity in the face of loss and hardship. Henry had revealed not just his musical talent, but his character. He had shown everyone in that room what real class and real strength looked like. And it had nothing to do with money or social status. Margaret stood at the bottom of the stage, completely humbled. She had learned more about music, about life, and about herself in the past 20 minutes than she had learned in years. Now she had to figure out what to do with this knowledge. Margaret stood frozen at the bottom of the stage steps. Her expensive wine glass hung forgotten in her hand. Her perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup could not hide the shock and shame written across her face. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret Whitmore felt truly small. The applause continued around her, but Margaret barely heard it. Her mind was spinning with realizations that made her feel sick to her stomach. For 15 years, one of the most talented musicians she had ever encountered had been working in her building. For 15 years, she had walked past him without seeing him as a real person. How many times had Henry emptied the trash can in her office while she talked on the phone about important business deals? How many times had he cleaned the conference room after her meetings while she discussed millions of dollars in contracts? How many times had she treated him like he was invisible, like he was nothing more than part of the furniture? Margaret remembered her cruel words from earlier in the evening. She had said that real talent was rare, that most people were not good enough to understand classical music. She had mocked the idea that anyone in the building could play Chopin properly. But Henry had been there the whole time, listening to every word. He had heard her dismiss people like his parents, people like his daughter, people like himself. He had heard her act like only wealthy, educated people deserved to appreciate beautiful things. Margaret felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She had made herself look like a fool in front of all these important people. But worse than that, she had revealed something ugly about her character that she had never wanted to admit. Even to herself, she was a snob. She was cruel. She judged people based on their jobs and their bank accounts instead of seeing who they really were inside. The applause finally began to die down, and people started talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. But Margaret could not join their conversations. She felt like she was drowning in her own shame and regret. Dr. Sterling approached the stage to shake Henry's hand. "Sir, that was absolutely incredible," he said with genuine admiration. "You have a remarkable gift." Other people gathered around to congratulate Henry and ask him more questions about his background. Everyone wanted to talk to the janitor who had turned out to be a master musician, but Margaret could not move from where she stood. She kept thinking about Henry's story, about all the sacrifices he had made for his family. While she had been born into wealth and given every advantage in life, Henry had worked hard for everything he achieved. And when life became difficult, he had given up his dreams to take care of the people he loved. Margaret had never made a sacrifice like that for anyone. She had always put her own success and comfort first. She had never even had to think about choosing between her career and her family, because money had never been a problem for her. Margaret also thought about Sophia, the little girl who had loved the beautiful night song. Henry had played Chopin for his dying daughter with such love and tenderness that it brought tears to Margaret's eyes just thinking about it. When was the last time Margaret had done something that loving and selfless for another person? She could not remember. Margaret watched Henry talking quietly with the guests who had gathered around him. Even now, surrounded by all this attention and praise, he remained humble and gentle. He answered their questions politely, but Margaret could see that he was emotionally exhausted from sharing his story. Suddenly, Margaret realized that she had not said a word to Henry since his performance ended. Everyone else had congratulated him and thanked him for the beautiful music, but she had just stood there in shock. She needed to say something. She owed him an apology, but she did not know how to begin. How do you apologize for 15 years of treating someone like they do not matter? How do you say sorry for being blind to someone's worth and dignity? Margaret took a shaky step toward the stage. Her legs felt weak, and her heart was pounding. She had given speeches to rooms full of powerful business leaders without feeling nervous, but approaching Henry felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. "Henry?" she called out softly. Henry looked down at her from the stage. His eyes were kind but tired. He had just poured his heart out to a room full of strangers, and Margaret could see that it had cost him something to share such painful memories. "Yes, ma'am," Henry said politely. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she possibly say that would matter? How could she express how sorry she was for her blindness and cruelty? The other guests sensed that something important was happening between Margaret and Henry. They stepped back to give them some privacy, but they kept watching and listening. Margaret tried again to speak. "Henry, she started, then stopped. Her voice was shaking. and tears were starting to form in her eyes. Henry saw her distress and climbed down from the stage to stand closer to her. Even after everything that had happened, he was still concerned about another person's feelings. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Henry asked gently. Margaret looked into Henry's eyes and saw something she had never expected to see. Despite all her cruelty and arrogance, despite the way she had treated him for 15 years, there was no anger in his gaze. There was sadness, yes, and tiredness. But there was also compassion. This realization broke something open inside Margaret's chest. The tears she had been holding back started flowing freely down her face. "Henry, I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I am so very, very sorry," Henry nodded quietly. "I know you are, ma'am." "No, you do not understand," Margaret said, her words coming out in a rush. "I have been terrible to you. I have been terrible to everyone who works in this building. I have treated people like they do not matter, like they are not even human." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring that her expensive makeup was running. "I called you invisible, but the truth is that I made myself blind. I chose not to see you because I thought your job made you less important than me." The room was completely quiet as people listened to Margaret's confession. No one had ever seen her show this kind of vulnerability before. "You have more talent, more dignity, and more strength than I will ever have," Margaret continued. "You sacrificed your dreams for your family. You worked hard jobs to take care of the people you loved. You honored your daughter's memory by sharing beautiful music with all of us tonight." Margaret took a shaky breath. "I have never done anything that brave or selfless in my entire life. I have only thought about myself and my own success." Henry listened to Margaret's words with a mixture of surprise and sadness. He had never expected to hear this proud, powerful woman admit to her mistakes so honestly. "Ma'am," Henry said softly, "we all make mistakes. The important thing is what we do after we realize we have been wrong." Margaret nodded, still crying. "You are right, and I want to do better. I want to be better. I do not know how to fix 15 years of being blind and cruel, but I want to try." Margaret looked around at all the guests who were watching this conversation. She realized that her public apology was the right thing to do, even though it was embarrassing and difficult. "Tonight, everyone in this room learned something important," Margaret said in a louder voice so everyone could hear. "We learned that worth and dignity have nothing to do with job titles or bank accounts. We learned that real talent and real character can be found anywhere if we are willing to see it." Margaret turned back to Henry. "Thank you for teaching me that lesson. Thank you for sharing your music and your story with us. Thank you for showing me who I really am and who I could choose to become." Henry looked at Margaret with new respect. It took courage to admit mistakes so publicly, especially for someone who was used to always being right and in control. "You are welcome, ma'am," Henry said simply. "And thank you for listening." Margaret felt like a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She still had a lot of work to do to become a better person, but admitting her failures was the first step. Now, she had to figure out how to turn her words into actions. 3 months had passed since the charity gala that changed everything. The story of Henry's remarkable performance had spread throughout the city. Newspapers wrote articles about the janitor who stunned a room full of wealthy socialites with his musical genius. Television stations ran features about hidden talent in unexpected places, but the real changes were happening quietly, away from all the media attention. Margaret sat in her office on a Tuesday morning, looking at papers for a new program she was creating. On her desk was a framed photo that had not been there before. It showed a young girl with bright eyes and a beautiful smile. Sofia Rodriguez had become an important part of Margaret's daily thoughts. Even though they had never met, there was a gentle knock on Margaret's office door. "Come in," she called. Henry entered the office carrying a folder of documents. But he was not wearing his janitor's uniform anymore. Instead, he wore a simple but nice business suit. His new job title was Director of Community Outreach and Education Programs. "Good morning, Margaret," Henry said with a warm smile. "I have." The final reports from our first month of music lessons. Margaret had asked Henry to call her by her first name instead of Ma'am or Miss Whitmore. It was a small change, but it represented something much bigger. She was learning to see Henry as an equal, not as someone beneath her. "How are the children doing?" Margaret asked, accepting the folder from Henry. Henry's face lit up with joy. "They are wonderful. We now have 45 students in the program. Some of them have never touched a piano before, but they are learning so quickly." The Sofia Rodriguez Memorial Music Program had been Margaret's idea, but Henry had made it real. They provided free piano lessons to children from low-income families. The program also gave scholarships to promising young musicians who wanted to attend music school but could not afford it. Margaret opened the folder and looked at photos of children sitting at piano benches, their faces full of concentration and happiness. Some of the kids were as young as 5 years old. Others were teenagers who had always dreamed of learning music but never had the chance. "Look at this one," Henry said, pointing to a photo of a 7-year-old boy playing piano. "His name is Miguel. His mother works 2 jobs to support the family, but Miguel practices piano for 2 hours every day. His teacher says he has real talent." Margaret smiled as she studied the photo. Miguel reminded her a little of how Henry must have looked when he was learning piano as a child. "Do you think he might be scholarship material?" "Definitely," Henry replied. "In fact, I would like to talk to you about expanding the scholarship program. We have 5 students who are ready for advanced training, but the local music schools are expensive." Margaret made a note in her calendar, set up a meeting with those schools. "I want to discuss partnerships that could help more students." This kind of conversation happened every week now. Margaret had discovered that using her wealth and business connections to help people felt much better than using them just to make more money for herself. The memorial program was not the only change Margaret had made. She had also completely changed how Whitmore Financial treated its employees. Janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers, and other support staff now received better pay, better benefits, and more respect from management. Margaret had instituted monthly meetings where any employee could suggest improvements to the workplace. She had created an employee scholarship fund that helped workers' children go to college. She had even started eating lunch in the employee cafeteria instead of in her private executive dining room. These changes had not happened overnight. Margaret had to work hard to overcome 15 years of bad habits and wrong thinking. Sometimes she caught herself falling back into her old patterns of arrogance and superiority. But Henry and other employees were patient with her as she learned to be a better leader and a better person. "There is something else I want to discuss with you," Henry said, sitting down in the chair across from Margaret's desk. "The children's concert is next month, and I was hoping you might consider saying a few words to the audience." Margaret felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. Speaking to business leaders and wealthy donors was easy for her now, but talking to families and children still made her anxious. She was afraid they would see through her efforts and realize she was still learning how to be genuinely caring. "I do not know, Henry," Margaret said uncertainly. "These families have heard about my reputation. They might not want to listen to someone like me." Henry leaned forward in his chair. "Margaret, you have changed more in 3 months than most people. Change in 3 years. The families in our program can see that you really care about their children. They trust you because your actions have proven that you are sincere." Margaret thought about this. The children's concert would be the first public performance by students in the Sofia Rodriguez Memorial Music Program. Local news stations planned to cover the event, and many prominent citizens had been invited to attend. But more importantly, it would be a celebration of what these young musicians had accomplished. They deserved to have their hard work recognized and honored. "All right," Margaret agreed. "I will speak at the concert. But I want you to speak too. This program exists because of Sofia's memory and your courage to share her story." Henry nodded. "Gratefully, I would be honored to do that." They spent the next hour discussing details for the concert. Henry had arranged for the children to perform a variety of pieces, from simple beginner songs to more advanced classical music. The program would end with Henry playing Chopin's Nocturne in I-flat major, Sophia's beautiful night song. As they worked together, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed. 3 months ago, she had been successful but empty inside. She had money and power, but no real relationships or meaningful purpose. Now she woke up every morning excited about the work she was doing. Helping children discover the joy of music felt more important than any business deal she had ever made. Seeing Henry's face light up when he talked about his students reminded her why human connections mattered more than profit margins. Margaret had also started taking piano lessons herself. She was not very good yet, but Henry was teaching her patiently during their lunch breaks. Learning music as an adult was much harder than she had expected, which gave her even more respect for what Henry had accomplished as a child. "Before you go," Margaret said as Henry prepared to leave her office, "I wanted to ask you something personal." Henry paused and looked at her with curiosity. "Do you think Sophia would approve of what we are doing?" Margaret asked quietly. "Do you think she would be happy about the program we created in her memory?" Henry's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. "I think Sophia would love seeing all these children discover music the way she did. I think she would be proud that her beautiful night song is helping other kids find joy and beauty in their lives." Margaret felt her own eyes getting misty. "I hope so. I never got to meet her, but she has become very important to me." "She would have liked you," Henry said with certainty. Sophia always believed that people could change and grow if they wanted to. She never gave up on anyone. After Henry left, Margaret sat alone in her office thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. One evening of cruelty and arrogance had led to a moment of truth that changed her entire life. She had learned that real wealth was not about money, it was about the connections you made with other people and the positive impact you had on the world. She had learned that talent and worth existed in places she had never thought to look. Most importantly, she had learned that it was never too late to become a better person. Margaret looked again at Sophia's photo on her desk. The little girl's bright smile seemed to be encouraging her to keep growing, keep learning, keep trying. To make a difference, next month at the children's concert, Margaret would stand in front of an audience and talk about the importance of music education and community support. Henry would play the beautiful night song that had started everything, and 45 children would share their musical gifts. With a room full of proud families, it would not erase the 15 years that Margaret had wasted being blind and cruel. It would not bring back Sophia or heal all of Henry's grief. But it was a beginning, a chance for redemption, growth, and hope. Margaret picked up her phone to call the music schools Henry had mentioned. There were scholarships to arrange, partnerships to negotiate, and more children to help. The invisible janitor had taught the powerful CEO that the most important things in life were often hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with courage and compassion to notice them, and Margaret was finally ready to see.